In 793, wealthy coastal towns huddled near open beaches. Merchant huts and storehouses had few watchposts, leaving them exposed to sudden violence from the sea. Unprotected markets along the shore attracted repeated Viking strikes. This spread panic through fishing villages, forcing families to abandon their boats, nets, and vital winter supplies. This is History and Society, where we explore how systems quietly shaped civilizations long before people understood what was happening. Order broke completely when Ivar the Boneless attacked the kingdom of Northumbria. He used swift raids to cripple local leaders and intimidate all of the nearby towns. The collapse of shoreline leadership proved a hard lesson. Visible wealth without layered defenses invited domination, a pattern other coastal communities could not afford to ignore. Around the year 800, sacred sites accumulated gifts and livestock. This concentrated immense value in isolated buildings, with clear, open paths from the sea directly to the altar. Monastic courtyards offered attackers very easy entry. This let them seize food stores and valuable metalwork, while nearby hamlets hesitated to confront the armed outsiders. Terror spread quickly after Abbot Higbald faced destruction in Northumbria. He watched helplessly as sanctuaries fell without any protective response from local forces. The ruined monastery ended the old assumption that sanctity alone could restrain violence. It accelerated acceptance that any effective defense must be physical, not just symbolic. By 810, seasonal watch routines were still common practice. Communities treated raids like brief storms, not as a repeating pattern that could harden into permanent occupation. Communities would rebuild quickly after a raid, only to suffer again. The lack of continuous patrols let attackers return to the very same inlets and rivers repeatedly. Strain deepened when King Ecgbert of Wessex faced fast-moving Viking bands. These groups would strike, withdraw, and then reappear unpredictably, keeping defenses off balance. These repeated blows exposed a critical weakness. Reactive musters could not match mobile warfare, pushing the idea of defense toward a state of constant readiness. During the 820s, local rulers competed fiercely for taxes and prestige. This left borders and coasts guarded unevenly and without any kind of shared command structure. Rival courts often delayed cooperation when threats appeared. As a result, warnings traveled slowly and reinforcements arrived late, often after farms and docks were already burned. Disunity grew worse as King Bjornwulf of Mercia struggled. He spent time negotiating with rivals while Viking raids exploited every single pause and moment of hesitation. This fragmented authority turned each kingdom into an isolated target. It ensured that attackers would face divided responses instead of a single united shield against them. Around the year 830, river routes became open corridors into England. And these waterways allowed Viking boats to bypass coastlines and reach inland storehouses, halls, and market crossings. Interior villages lacked barricades and effective signal systems. Alarms often arrived only after attackers had already loaded captives and valuables onto their shallow draft ships. Penetration surged as Halfdan Ragnarsson moved deep into East Anglia. He used the kingdom's waterways to strike settlements far beyond the reach of any coastal watch. This new inland exposure destroyed the long-held idea of a safe interior. It forced defense planning to treat all major rivers as potential invasion roads. Around 835, payments began to replace active deterrence. Resources shifted from training and fortification toward short-term bargains, meant only to delay destruction, not prevent it. Paying ransoms normalized the idea that safety could be purchased. This encouraged repeated demands from raiders whenever defenders appeared weak, divided, or unwilling to fight. Dependence on this strategy grew as King Æthelwulf of Wessex acted. He began paying raiders to withdraw from his lands, instead of risking his fragile forces in battle. This pattern of payment signaled profitable weakness to the Vikings. It invited more raids and tightened the destructive cycle of extortion across the English kingdoms. Around the year 845, local militias remained scattered and disorganized. They assembled slowly and lacked the mobility to intercept attackers who chose their own timing and landing points. Delayed musters meant defenders often arrived to find smoke rising from docks and barns. They were left chasing empty shorelines after the raiders had already sailed away. Isolation became a critical problem, as shown when King Edmund resisted in East Anglia. He confronted coordinated strikes without any reliable support from neighboring English forces. This lone resistance failed to scale against larger Viking armies. It taught attackers that piecemeal defenses could be overwhelmed one by one, repeatedly and effectively. In 850, overwintering camps began to appear for the first time. This broke the expectation that raiders would retreat each season, restoring military pressure year-round. These permanent camps drained local food supplies and morale. Nearby towns now faced a constant, persistent threat instead of just brief, seasonal shocks from hit-and-run raids. Control tightened as the Viking leader Guthrum established positions in Wessex. He turned simple raids into a sustained pressure of occupation on the kingdom's leadership. This new year-round presence transformed the conflict. It shifted from simple theft to a direct pressure on governance, forcing defenders to rethink time, supply, and readiness. Around 865, public intimidation escalated dramatically. The Vikings used visible cruelty and staged destruction to weaken resistance before any decisive battle had even been fought. Rumors of this terror outran the armies themselves. Towns surrendered early, priests fled their posts, and markets emptied, spreading collapse faster than physical conquest alone. Legitimacy cracked as Ivar the Boneless humiliated rulers in Northumbria. He demonstrated his dominance in public spaces, shattering the authority of the local lords. This public humiliation shattered political morale across the region. It made organized resistance much harder to coordinate, even where defenders still had the manpower to fight. By the year 870, English planning remained dangerously reactive. Defenses were formed only after damage was done, leaving attackers free to choose their own targets and tempo. Repeated losses trained communities to expect punishment, not victory. This encouraged flight and payment rather than coordinated preparation and interception of the enemy forces. The strategic initiative shifted as Halfdan Ragnarsson acted in Mercia. He forced English leaders to respond to his threats, rather than allowing them to set their own strategy. Control of the tempo granted attackers a state of strategic dominance. This advantage kept defenders permanently off balance, and always one step behind unfolding events. Around 875, English supply systems lagged far behind the needs of warfare. Defenders relied on short musters that consumed local stores and disbanded quickly under prolonged pressure. Attackers learned to exploit this critical weakness. They would strike when defenders dispersed or when local granaries were low after hurried, short-lived mobilizations. This strain surfaced as King Alfred struggled to sustain his forces in Wessex. He faced persistent pressure across all seasons, stretching his resources to their absolute limit. The supply problem revealed a fundamental truth about the war. Survival required logistics and continuity, not only courage and last-minute emergency musters of local troops. Around 880, fortifications existed unevenly across the landscape. Gaps between strong points allowed raiders to slip through the defensive lines and raid the countryside at will. Isolated forts could save nearby homes, but the surrounding fields still burned. Trade routes remained unsafe, weakening the very economy that was needed to fund the defense. Networks began to form as Alfred organized fortified towns, or burhs, in Wessex. These were designed to cover roads and block rapid enemy penetration into the heartland. These new integrated strongpoints reduced the enemy's freedom of movement. It proved that coordination between forts mattered more than just having isolated, disconnected walls. By 885, constant demands for soldiers and supplies drained resources. This weakened the ability of the kingdoms to invest in ships, patrols, and professionally trained forces. Economic stress pushed farmers to abandon their land and merchants to reroute trade. This, in turn, shrank the tax base that was needed for a sustained national defense. Choices hardened as King Alfred balanced immediate survival costs against long-term reform. He had to manage the crisis of the present while building a structure for the future. This hard balance showed that any lasting reform must be financed steadily. Otherwise, the constant pressure of war would consume any hope for a more secure future. Around the year 890, war fatigue spread among English households. Repeated alarms and calls to arms disrupted harvests, marriages, and the stability of local markets. Communities began to hesitate to muster again for battle. Local leaders lost credibility when their promises of safety and security repeatedly failed to hold up. Confidence wavered as Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, rallied local defenses. She fought to restore order at a time when morale had already severely weakened. This collapse in morale proved that defense is a social as well as a military challenge. It requires trust, stability, and the momentum of repeated visible success. System reform advanced during 895. The English shifted from improvised response toward a planned readiness, anchored in fortified routes and more organized, reliable musters. Better readiness reduced the element of surprise for the Vikings. It forced attackers into riskier moves and shrank the space where terror alone could win them battles. Stability increased as Alfred imposed coordinated defense routines across Wessex. These new systems covered the kingdom's towns, roads, and strategic river crossings. The stabilized system restored a sense of predictability for civilians. This strengthened resilience across the kingdom and reduced the payoff of random, opportunistic violence. Around 900, new attacks tested these reforms. Raiders probed for weak points in the network of fortified routes and strongholds, looking for gaps in the growing system. Defensive failures still occurred, but the system held. Warnings traveled faster and musters arrived earlier, limiting destruction and discouraging the prospect of easy raids. Durability showed as Edward the Elder applied his father Alfred's structures. He maintained the system under repeated pressure, proving its fundamental strength and design. The survival of the system under testing proved the reforms were transferable. It enabled defense to persist beyond the lifetime and leadership of a single visionary ruler. Around 905, regional gaps in the defense network remained. Some districts had fortified quickly while others lagged behind, leaving exposed corridors for raiders to exploit. Attackers targeted these weaker zones, using them as entry points. From there, they could threaten stronger areas and strain the coordination of defenses across wide distances. Local strength mattered, as Æthelflæd demonstrated in Mercia. She focused on securing key towns that blocked enemy movement routes and controlled strategic choke points. Closing these corridors systematically reduced enemy options. It showed that targeted fortification could reshape the entire strategic map and dictate the flow of the war. By 910, central authority was expanding across the English territories. This reduced rival command structures and allowed for unified planning under a single overarching direction. Unified command improved mobilization speed and efficiency. It made responses faster and limited the ability of attackers to isolate and defeat targets one by one. Unification advanced as Edward the Elder consolidated territories. He used a combination of coordinated defense and direct military pressure to bring regions under his control. This consolidation reduced the old problem of fragmentation. It turned separate, weak zones into a single, cohesive system capable of coordinated and effective resistance. In 915, settlement patterns began to shift significantly. Foreign warriors established their own farms and trading posts, anchoring a long-term presence on English soil. Daily life adjusted around mixed markets and guarded roads. This created a tense coexistence that, in some areas, reduced the frequency of constant, open fighting. Accommodation emerged as Guthrum's successors began to rule locally. They governed their lands while slowly integrating into existing English political and social structures. These integrated settlements changed the nature of the conflict. It became a negotiation over governance, blurring the line between who was an enemy and who was a neighbor. Legal adaptation accelerated during the 920s. Local rules adjusted to manage the new mixed communities and to prevent the outbreak of constant destructive revenge cycles. Courts and markets became tools of social and political control. They stabilized trade while quietly embedding new legal norms into the daily administration of the land. A new hybrid order formed as English and Danish elites worked together. They shaped laws to maintain stability for everyone and to secure their own shared profit. This legal blend reduced open violence and replaced destructive raids. In their place came structured authority, regulated extraction of wealth, and a more predictable order. Pressure eased briefly during 925. External attention shifted elsewhere, while internal consolidation continued to strengthen defensive routines across key routes and regions. This breathing room allowed for vital repairs, training, and shipbuilding. It improved readiness without the constant drain on resources caused by emergency mobilizations. Consolidation continued as Edward the Elder secured borders and strengthened administration. He worked to build depth and resilience into the newly unified Kingdom of England. This period of consolidation built a stronger foundation for the future. It made later attacks much harder to succeed and raised the cost of renewed large-scale raids. Around 930, coastal insecurity persisted despite the inland reforms. Sea routes still allowed sudden strikes against harbors, storehouses, and vital coastal trade hubs. Merchants demanded better protection for their goods and ships. Patrol failures continued to create local panic, showing that land reforms had not fully solved naval exposure. Testing of the English defenses resumed as Norse leaders launched fast coastal raids. They probed the coastline, seeking weaknesses in the kingdom's naval and port defenses. This coastal probing kept fear alive and served as a stark reminder. It showed English rulers that naval capacity remains a decisive lever in any coastal war. By 935, the basis of legitimacy had shifted. Kingship became tied to the capacity to protect the realm, not just to inheritance, raising public expectations for visible security. Weak protection invited rebellion and new demands for tribute. Strong protection, however, attracted loyalty and the taxes that were needed to reinforce defense even further. Authority hardened as King Æthelstan projected power across England. He demonstrated his strength through large musters and tight control over the kingdom's fortified routes. This new protection-based legitimacy strengthened central rule. It directly aligned the political survival of the king with the military effectiveness of the kingdom. Around 940, professional forces expanded throughout the kingdom. These standing armies began to replace irregular mobilization, providing more reliable readiness and reducing vulnerability to surprise. Improved readiness limited the success of raiders. It forced attackers to seek easier targets in other lands or withdraw when the risks of attacking England grew too high. Watch the full episode on History in a Society to understand how systems quietly shape the world you live in.